Hello, it's been a while since we've done a video, but this is mainly for A-level film studies when looking at Vertigo and an Alien comparison. This is going to be one aspect, and I'll do another video on a different aspect. But if you're studying EDUQAS film studies A-level, you'll know that one of the questions is a comparative element, and that is, in my case, the comparison between Vertigo and Alien. Now, on the surface, it's quite difficult to look at these two films and think there's anything to really compare, but the question is focused mainly around auteur theory and usually something related to auteur theory. Now, that means that there are certain specific elements, such as specific visual storytelling from both auteurs, or other elements that could be compared, not just the film's content itself. Because if you talk about the films in sort of a vacuum, it's very difficult to sort of justify them being similar or different because they're both from different eras, they both have very different genres and so on. But what I'm going to try and do here is talk to you about some of the areas of comparison and how they could relate to whatever question you're given. Okay, so we'll get started. Now, I'm mostly focusing on the use of colour today, which is going to be how Hitchcock, and also to a lesser extent, I suppose, it can be linked to Alien. So before we begin, really, as I've sort of mentioned in my own classes, colour theory is very subjective. Okay, you'll often have several different interpretations of colour. There are accepted interpretations, but there are also interpretations that are less accepted, but still valid. Critics are still divided on this, and also you can offer your own interpretations in the exam, as long as you justify them and justify your thoughts, a bit like English literature, where you can justify pretty much anything you say within reason. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to start off with the use of green. Now, green is one of the most prominent colours in Vertigo. The use of it with when Judy turns into Madeline here, we've got the silhouette of Judy and the green in the background, and then obviously we've got her green outfits. And in the same vein, her green outfits when we first see her inside the Red Room. Now, many interpret the use of green here as linking to deception or mystery. So it has quite an ethereal glow about it, which almost looks ghostly. But characters that tend to wear green or are enveloped in green are deceptive characters. So, for example, Madeline and Judy are often seen in green, but also Scotty is seen in green when he is deceiving Madeline by saying, I rescued you and I'm just a passerby. He's not. He's been stalking her the entire time. Okay. In the same way, her car is quite significant being green. The Jaguar is green. Allowing her to stand out. She's easily able to be tracked, and our eye, just like Scotty's eye, is drawn to her, which links to the use of voyeurism in the film. We are observing Judy / Madeline through the eyes of Scotty, which means those visual elements, such as the heavy use of green and the red later on, they draw our eye, just like Scotty's eye is drawn to her. Okay. And she is often bathed in it. And as you can see here, as I mentioned earlier, the ethereal glow or the ghostly presentation of Madeline, it builds a mystery around her, but also allows her to almost feel ghostly, like something coming back from the dead later in the film, when Judy resurrects Madeline as a concept. Okay. And we've talked about this, but Scotty wearing the green jumper here in this sequence shows that he is also deceiving or being deceptive. And we'll get on to red a little bit later, but they almost they clash quite significantly, the two colors, but at the same time that they meld well together. Think of Christmas, you know, green and red tend to go together, but they do clash. So in terms of context, then, this is quite a useful element to talk about now. Commercially, Vertigo didn't do very well at the box office. It wasn't a very well received film, and it sort of sent Hitchcock into a little bit of a depression. He ended up storing the film away in a safe, and it wasn't really discovered until the 90s. Sort of the late 80s, they started talking about it, and in the 90s, they started to develop a restoration. And they were looking to restore the colour specifically. It's quite an important motif in the film, and they wanted to make sure they based the restoration around those colours. So they actually contacted Jaguar to get the exact shade of green for the Jaguar Mark 8, which helped inform the colour palette of the film. And it serves as that motif of deception, of lying, and so on. Okay, so that's the color green. Now, as I said, green and red are opposing on the color wheel. They clash, but they also are complementing colors, so they tend to be worn together, but they're very different, or different enough to work well together as well. Okay, so then we've got the use of red. And when I talked through this in class, there were several different interpretations that you could come up with. But not only are there interpretations, there are also quite wild theories when it comes to vertigo and the use of red. Like I said, all are relatively valid. Everything is subjective, so being able to analyze it and seeing what you think is important. Now, the use of red, as I've got here, the more accepted opinion is that it's passion, desire, tension, danger, those kind of things. And Madeline has these motifs of red that follow her, and red overlays tend to surround Scotty, especially when he's in this dream sequence here. It could symbolize how dangerous Scotty's involvement is with Madeline, that it's eventually going to cause his downfall. And I always think of this sequence and the overlay of red in comparison to something like Kill Bill, where the bride sees a character and everything goes red and you hear that, whining sound in the ears. Again, it's symbolic of this danger, but also passion and desire and want for characters. So earlier on, when I showed you this bit of Madeline in red, there are several ways you could interpret that. One, it links to her suicide attempt because you could see the idea of blood, as if she's drenched in blood. You could also see it as desire and passion on Scotty's part, that he's seeing her as a sexual object. But there are other ways you could look at it too. When Madeline's body is on top of the red roof, it's almost as if she's drowned in this blood, that we're almost using the visual element of red to symbolize death or blood, because you weren't obviously allowed to show gratuitous amount of blood at this time. Each code would have prevented it, and also, sensibilities at the time weren't quite the same. Yeah. But you could argue it as quite fatalistic, rather than a more passionate or desiring element of color. And like I said, she's drowned in blood here. When she falls onto the roof of the church, she's covered in blood, the same way as the red outfit. So red is quite a polarizing color in the film. It could mean passion, desire. It could mean blood. It could mean death. It could mean, danger. So we talked then about how do red and green visuals help to explore the narrative of Vertigo? How do they tell the story? And as we've talked about, being able to compare and talk about how green and red influence the film is really important for your understanding of it. And if a question talks about visual elements in the film, like what visual elements help the film to be auteur, or what influence of the auteur links to visual elements, you can talk about color theory and the importance of color. Hitchcock was a very visual storyteller, so everything needed to be sort of given in a visual medium rather than resorting to dialogue. He uses heavy dialogue and he has some beautiful dialogue in his films, but above all, he's a visual storyteller, and that is because of his German expressionist background. He was able to study in Berlin at the time and was able to sort of look into German expressionism and understand how important the visual element was for telling stories. So the color links into that visual interpretation. Okay, so we're now onto the more lesser known colors. If anyone talks about Vertigo and talks about color theory in Vertigo, most people will always draw upon the green and the red, but there are other colors in the film that are really important. So for example, the use of blue here with Scotty. Now I've taken an image here of his suit. We've got the sort of bluish overlay here, or the bluish background and lighting that we see when Madeline becomes real again, I suppose. And then we've also got it in the opening sequence with a very heavy tint. Okay. Now, blue is often associated in the film with Scotty's failure or his lack of masculine identity, that he is not the man that he once was, and that his vertigo has shaken him, his acrophobia. It's quite a melancholic shade. It sort of bleeds sadness, I suppose. But it could also be used in this sequence, for example, as I mentioned, with the bluish tone in the background. There's also guilt on both sides, that Judy fooled him and broke him as a man, and he failed because he wasn't able to pull himself up, and he suffered from acrophobia and ended up causing somebody's death. So it's important to understand that it could be several interpretations, but the more accepted idea is the failure or lack of masculine identity. And then we've got the use of yellow and orange, and this is mostly associated with Midge. She's an interesting character, and I also think she's quite a she's a deeply sad character, because as much as she is there to support Scotty, she is consistently rejected by him. So if you look at these two images, you've got the yellow on Midge here, and then you've got the orange that comes on Midge later. At the beginning, she is sort of this bland color that blends into the background of her environment. As you can see, the environment also reflects that shade of yellow. And she also has this sort of melancholic tone of blue that goes on the windows. And as we talked about earlier, him looking down over the windows and looking down at the street would trigger his vertigo. It's almost like a point of shame for him that he can't go near the windows. And that's proven when he gets up on the stepladder and then looks over. But she doesn't stand out. She blends in, and it's almost as if Midge is the secondary pale choice for Scotty, that she's the bland version of his life, even though contextually she's quite a sexually liberated character. She's a brassiere designer, and she sort of flirtatiously talks with him about her designs, which shows that she's quite liberated, and she's becoming there's a different type of woman rather than someone who's controlled and repressed. But she still fawns over Scotty. She's obsessed with him. And this comes to fruition later, especially when she has the painting that replicates the Madeline painting, I suppose, where she's trying to sort of entice him into seeing her differently. And she starts to wear orange. But again, that shade of orange pales in comparison to the greens and the reds that stand out for Madeline. So she always is trying to grasp his attention, but she can never fully get it. And like we've talked before, the film is from a voyeuristic perspective. We're viewing it through Scotty's eyes. He's seeing her as less vibrant and less colourful than Madeline, who is his other choice. She will never, ever be able to be with him again because he has moved past her. He sees her as bland and pale. So we've talked about all of these elements, and then another typical kind of idea. How does Vertigo use colour theory to manipulate our understanding of characters? Well, we've just talked about it. The use of blue manipulates our understanding of Scotty as an emasculated man. And we've got the yellow that symbolises the blandness of Midge, that she is not really there for him to desire, no longer at least, not in comparison to someone like Madeline. Okay. And we talk, and in class, I go over this article, but this section that I've got on the screen is just enough to sort of talk about. There's a quote there from him that says, "The silent pictures were the purest form of cinema." And the reason he talks about this is because his initial early films were silent films, and he was able to learn a visual storytelling style in Germany, and he was able to understand European cinema far more, which means that being able to tell a story through its visuals without dialogue is really important to Hitchcock's films. And that isn't unlike Alien, because Alien is also a very visual film, because Ridley Scott, by his own admission, is a visual storyteller. He likes to include images that sweepingly talk about, or well, don't even talk, sweepingly allow us to see into what he's trying to say or his story, okay? So it says here, that Hitchcock between 25 and 29 were all silent films, his first 9 films. So his German expressionist side is seen clearly through this. If you watch Blackmail is very visual. So being able to understand that the silent pictures were the purest form of cinema in its mind, we can start to understand his auteur background and where his control and his visual storytelling really comes from. And that's going to be very useful if you have to write about auteur theory and visual storytelling or visuals in film. So we're thinking then about Ridley Scott comparing to Hitchcock. So we've talked a lot about colour here, but now this is how does he compare to Hitchcock visually. So both of them have extended long takes on set design. So, for example, we've got the bar sequence or the restaurant sequence here from Vertigo, where we have Scotty's eye line as it travels, and we extend into the rest of the room, and we can see that his eye is immediately drawn to where Madeline is sat. So using that eye line focus, we're going to come back to that later, but using that eye line shot, we get to see it from his perspective. And obviously she is vibrant and colourful because in Scotty's mind, she's vibrant and colourful. In the same way as we've got the inside of the alien ship from Alien, where it's an extended sequence where they use a crane to zoom out to see the environment. It becomes this sort of big set piece with a heavy emphasis on setting. The same way as they use an editing technique, both of them use the same kind of editing technique, which is the Kuleshov effect. Now, we see it in Alien with Ash as he's observing Kane being overtaken by the alien, and obviously the famous chestburster scene. The camera switches from Ash back to Kane, back to Ash, so we can see Ash's reaction and how, in a way, he doesn't really react, mainly because he's expecting it. So we as an audience can tell straight away that Ash may not be what he seems, and we see that come to fruition later. In the same way as Scotty does this when he is observing Madeline, we see him, then the Kuleshov effect happens where we shoot back to where Madeline is, and then we see Scotty's reaction to Madeline. So we can see that he becomes obsessed with her over the course of the film. So this is where they're using visual elements to tell the story. There is I was about to say there's no dialogue. There's definitely dialogue in the Ash and Kane scene, but it's sort of periphery dialogue. Ash never says anything, and Kane is sort of just choking and dying. So it's still told very visually, the same way as in these sequences. It's just a lone man peeping on a woman, as we've talked about before. And be able to observe that through the Kuleshov effect shows that we are preying on her almost. We are watching her just like he's preying on her and watching her. It's quite an uncomfortable thing to think about, but it's important, and the Kuleshov effect allows that to happen. The same ways I talked about a moment ago with eyeline matching. Now, eyeline matching is not used as much in Alien, but it's used heavily in Hitchcock's Vertigo for us to see from Scotty's perspective and see Madeline. But what you do have in Alien as a comparative point is the frequent use of close-ups and the chiaroscuro effect, which is the heavy emphasis on shadows and emphasis on contrasts. So you've got, for example, here, some of the characters such as Ripley with her face half shrouded. Once again, it's this emphasis on seeing emotion reaction and seeing how these characters cope with the events that are going on. Whereas with eyeline matching, it's more about focusing on what Scotty's seeing and how we can observe it from his point of view. Okay, so what I did then in my lesson, I talked a little bit about the opening titles and how important they are. And there was a little bit on Hitchcock's philosophy here where it says, when we tell a story in cinema, we should resort to dialogue only when it's impossible to do otherwise. I always try first to tell a story in a cinematic way through a succession of shots and bits of film in between. It's important to understand Hitchcock's auteurism by looking at that quotation. Dialogue only when necessary, when it's impossible to do otherwise. Telling something visually through something like colour is far more important in Hitchcock's mind. Well, I hope that's been useful. That is just the first of a series of videos on Vertigo and Alien and some comparative points you can make. I hope it's been useful, and thank you for listening.